I'm Dr. Brad Hafford, archaeologist and economic anthropologist. Welcome to Nook, where I take a close look at paper money from the past. As an anthropologist, I'm more interested in what money says than what it's worth. And it says a great deal about the government that issued it and the people who used it. Today, we look at a badly worn and torn 50 drachma note issued in Greece in 1935. I've chosen it for its imagery, but also because the wear patterns themselves tell us something about its use life. We'll begin by looking at the obverse, or front of the note. It's the side that has the clearest indication of the issuing authority. In this case, that authority is Trapezatis Elados, the Bank of Greece. The obverse often bears the portrait of an important person from the country, or, as in this case, a representation of the people as a group. The portrait here is an idealized image of a woman in a headscarf and traditional high-collared jacket. There is emphasis on the woman's hands, which hold a large bundle of wheat. In fact, the note is largely dedicated to agricultural abundance, and particularly to grain. So this woman and her wheat is to some extent being paralleled with the classical Greek Ceres, the goddess of agriculture. Her name is the derivation of the English word cereal, referring to grain, and her Roman name was Demeter. We'll hear more about her when we look at the reverse. Meanwhile, let's address the damage this note displays. It has many tears along the edges and has been completely torn in half lengthwise. This long tear has been patched some 5 years after its initial issue, using pieces of postage stamps. The pieces all come from the same type of stamp, a 20 lepta denomination depicting St. Demetrios of Thessaloniki. The stamp was issued to commemorate the Thessaloniki Exposition of 1934, but it was still in use in 1939 when its value was increased with an ink stamp to 1 drachma. The fact that it has been repaired so extensively and still circulated despite the damage shows how little physical currency was available in Greece at the time. The country was in flux. It had declared a second republic in 1924, brought back its monarchy in 1935, and then experienced a military coup in 1936. Next came the Second World War, beginning in 1939 and heavily impacting Greece by 1940. Exchange was of course still necessary throughout the turbulent political times between the world wars, and so a form of money was needed. The 1935 notes thus circulated a great deal and continued to do so well into the German and Italian occupation 6 years later. Even with notes that are exchangeable for gold or silver, one must trust that it will be honored in exchange. This note wasn't completely backed by silver, though it does state drachme pinti conta, 50 drachma, plirotee ti emphanisi, which is payable on appearance or presentation of the note. But what would be paid isn't stated. It was likely to be coins, but probably base metal coins, if those were available at all. To help people believe the note will serve in daily exchange and for debts to the government, banknotes typically carry signatures of banking officials on the obverse. Here, we see that pattern exactly, with 3 signatures: the chief officer, the general secretary, and the manager of the bank. Looking at more of the detail, we see not just wheat, but also the New World crop, corn or maize, at the very edge. We also see flowers, apparently roses and daisies, and what I think are acanthus leaves, though perhaps they're oak. The background is made up primarily of splayed tops of wheat sheaves intermingled with daisies, though it's hard to see on this example. The art style and even the type of paper is characteristically French, and indeed the note was printed in France. The intricate designs that we see and the multiple colors are part protections against counterfeit. Another security element is the watermark. Embedded in the paper, it can only be seen when light shines through from behind. In this case, the watermark is partially obscured by a piece of a stamp holding the tear on the reverse, but we can tell that it's a profile image of a woman. She is the goddess Ceres herself, wearing a wreath of leaves, facing left towards her counterpart, the idealized agricultural Greek woman. As the light shines through from behind, we see that there are many more stamps holding the tear in the back. We flip the note over and we find that they are all from the 20 lepta stamp, with at least 3 having been used to keep this note in circulation. They all bear the 1939 reissue stamp DR1, meaning that 3 drachma in postal value was used to keep this 50 drachma banknote afloat. The primary image on the reverse is that of Ceres herself. She wears a banded crown of leaves and flowers, and it's standing in her closely braided hair. In her left hand she holds an olive sprig. Although Ceres is closely associated with grain, she was the goddess of agriculture in general, and one of the most important crops throughout Greece is the olive, so naturally, her realm would include it. Olive sprigs are also often used to represent peace. Her blue robe stands out against the browns and yellows and greens of the background, as do the roses in her right hand, and what may be narcissus flowers at her shoulder. Even if they aren't narcissus flowers, those make such a good transition to the imagery behind her in this note that I'm going to call them that regardless. You see, legend has it that Ceres' daughter, Persephone, was lured to Hades with narcissus flowers, and the image in the center background of this note depicts both Ceres and Persephone. The image comes from an ancient stone frieze known as the Great Eleusinian Relief. Ceres stands at left, Persephone at right, and between them is Triptolemus, a young boy to whom Ceres gave the secret of wheat, and he was supposed to pass that on to mortals. He's a kind of vehicle of knowledge to help enlighten the people with a gift from the gods. There's another story involving Ceres and a boy. In this one, Ceres accepts a barley drink, beer, from an old woman after a long day. The boy, though, he mocks her, saying that she's not really tired and thirsty, just a greedy drunk. And Ceres promptly turned him into a lizard. This note doesn't show that story, but I wanted to tell it anyway. Sometimes we just need a beer after a long, hard day. The reverse often emphasizes the laws that authorize or protect the note, but this one has very little text. It tells us the name of the issuing bank and the denomination, but the only other text is ekdosis proti, or first printing. The background is once again elaborate, with many leaves, including olives and palmettes, and what appear to be lemons. I wanted to stretch them to be pomegranates, since Persephone again has a connection with that fruit. She was forced to stay in the realm of Hades because she ate 3 pomegranate seeds there. But they aren't pomegranates. Finally, we have the classical Greek meander, a design that crosses over itself endlessly in a labyrinthine border. So what more can this note tell us about Greece in 1935? The country had shifted from monarchy to republic in 1924. Then, a rigged vote of about 98% brought back King George II in 1935. The note was issued in September of 35 when the king had returned, but only a few months later, General Ioannis Metaxas declared a military dictatorship. Metaxas claimed that he was preventing a communist-inspired Republican coup by instituting martial law. By 1939, money was already in short supply. Precious metal was leaching out of the economy, as it so often does in hard times, and promissory notes had to suffice. But even these were not overly common. They circulated so much that torn notes were regularly repaired by anyone and everyone and put back into circulation. The Bank of Greece authorized new issues with no commodity backing in order to support the fight against the Italian forces trying to move in from Albania in 1940. The monetary supply went up by more than 70%, but with no backing, it led to inflation, and cost of living rose by 12% almost immediately. Inflation might have been even worse, but the Greek military initially succeeded against the Italians, and belief in the drachma continued to be relatively high. But in 1941, the Germans joined the fight, and the Axis powers occupied Greece in April of that year. The 1935 issue notes circulated well into the German occupation, and in 1941, those that had been slated for destruction in the banks were reissued. Many notes of this period are found with 6 regularly spaced cancellation holes punched into them. These functioned as legal tender despite the holes. The Greek people were forced to pay for the occupying armies, and many Greeks starved as a consequence. Germans and Italians took so much from the country, and external trade was so difficult that hyperinflation resulted. Even though the German forces required the new puppet Bank of Greece to issue more notes from 1942 to 1944, They were almost worthless by the time they hit the streets. By 1944, cost of living had increased more than 1 trillion times its 1941 level, and there was absolutely no confidence in the drachma. At first glance, this worn-out and torn old piece of paper seems only fit for the rubbish bin. But on closer examination, we can come to understand the signs of history and hardship that are contained within it. The very fact that it has been desperately pasted back together with uncancelled stamps shows how important it was to keep some form of circulating value in the economy. Imagine all the people who carried and handled this note over a decade of troubled times. Its imagery speaks of an abundance of food, and yet the reality was starvation for much of the country. I hope you enjoyed looking at this banknote with me. I'm Dr. Brad Hafford. Join me again next time on Nook, part of my series, Money Talks.